so much for tuning in to another episode of Beyond the Device. I'm on with the fantastic and wonderful Jason Claybrook from Aura Wireless. Jason, thank you so much for joining me today, buddy.
It's great, as always, to be here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your energy that you always bring to this. Talking today specifically about Aura Wireless and some of the things that we've seen in these community Wi-Fi projects that have been popping up. Aura's got a fantastic solution for that. A lot of this, I think, started with Wi-Fi connectivity options for the student population as people were going remote because of COVID-19. And we saw a lot of issues with that. And I think we're going to talk about that in ways that we can help solve that, hopefully, with a partnership with Aura amongst some of the other organizations that we work with in partnership with. But over to you first and foremost for some opening comments around what we're talking about today, Jason.
Sure. You know, it's, it kind of feels like maybe some days the last 6 months have been excruciatingly slow since the whole lockdown and COVID really hit everybody, punched us in the nose. And other days we're seeing things just advance so quickly and the learnings are coming so quickly that it's, you know, it's been kind of rewarding to see how some people have come together and started really solving some pretty critical problems. You know, I would say if we're just jumping straight into it, man, back in the spring, and you know better than me with what 3i does, how fast were Wi-Fi's falling off the shelf and everybody. We got to put something into the economically disadvantaged hands because kids are going to be at home and studying, and there's nothing out there aside from a Wi-Fi solution that's just going to rapidly put internet in people's hands. And then you fast forward, you know, even with summer months of planning, the stimulus packages, everything, we're talking about doing some really big transformative things now in a very short window of time. And that's one of the really cool, rewarding things that we've seen over the last several months is, you know, tell you, I just read an RFP just the other day, and it talks about this and their goals for building out community Wi-Fi. They recognize, hey, what we did 6 months ago, that was a Band-Aid. It was an expensive Band-Aid, but it was the only Band-Aid. You know, we reached in the drawer, we grabbed what we could, and we went with it. You know, and that was your Wi-Fi type solution. But now you have data points, you have proof points, and saying, you know what, we just saturated a bunch of cell towers, and we just did some pretty unnatural things with Wi-Fi hotspots. Those things aren't meant to be on for 10, 12 hours at a time and feed the whole family of 4 or 5 or 6, right?
Right. Melting. Sometimes we actually see, or cell phones, for example, the hotspots and the cell phones that have been just plugged in and turned on for just hours upon hours upon hours. It's definitely not how those things were meant. It was more of a supplemental, not a conduit to connectivity in permanence.
Right. So kind of one of the great things that we're seeing is when you think about different network access technologies, unlicensed, spectrum licensed, your traditional wireline applications, historically, everybody's always treated that, well, I'm either going to do this one or I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this one. Mm-hmm. And at the same time that we go through this pandemic, you have a lot of new technologies really starting to percolate and show up out there. You have private LTE and CBRS really taking hold, and in some respects accelerating. Are we going to take a lot longer for CBRS to have a place in this world? Mm-hmm. We're seeing right now, because of COVID, the CBRS deployments accelerate, private LTE. You're seeing a lot, you know, when we were talking a couple years ago of, hey, what's the 5G use cases, and being able to use that to densify connectivity for these really advanced things, you know, and people talk about the weird stuff like remote surgery and the Back to the Future stuff, so we can have self-driving DeLoreans, and that's all cool and wonderful. That's coming down the pipe someday, but right now we have bigger, more practical things that we have to deal with. And then you have Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi 6. And, you know, we were having these discussions a couple of years ago where, you know, the question was, hey, 5G is coming, CBRS is coming. so Wi-Fi is dead, right? And the answer that everybody had 2 years ago was, no, Wi-Fi is not dead. Every time we accelerate these other technologies, guess what else accelerates? Wi-Fi. Right. And now we have Wi-Fi 6, and we have specs coming out on adding 6 gigahertz. So an enormous swath of unlicensed spectrum coming. And I think what's really rewarding is, these camps had different people in it. And these different people, this was, hey, I'm in the CBRS camp. Hey, I'm in the Wi-Fi camp. I'm in the LAA. I'm in the 5G camp. And my solution is going to work better. And what we're seeing now is people are recognizing really, not to go overly Trump, but really smart people are saying it's not one or the other. It's all of them.
Was this happen? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but doesn't this always happen in tech? Like there's like a new thing, and everyone goes, "Oh, that's going to replace everything. That's going to be the thing." And it's like, it can't, because at the edge of all of the peripheral devices that you were just talking about, all the different spectrum, Wi-Fi is at the very, very edge of all of that from a connectivity perspective. And this is like one of the things that we were talking about within CBRS coming, and like some of the people that are putting all of their eggs in the CBRS, the 5 gigahertz, the 5G basket, which is, it's great from a tech perspective. And yes, we do need people focusing on it, but the amount of devices that actually have the ability to connect to those signals, they're really not that plentiful.
There's a technology adoption curve that takes a long time to overcome.
100%, right.
And the problem that everybody's solving for with these community Wi-Fi projects is primarily for our economically disadvantaged. So is the idea that I'm going to take the latest and greatest Android or iOS device, or the latest and greatest laptop that's got the latest and greatest 5G chipset, or it's got Band 48, and forklift up thousands upon millions of devices for its connectivity, and build a network to reach them all that doesn't exist? Am I going to go through both expenses simultaneously? That's not going to happen. That's not practical. That's not good fiduciary responsibility. But I can take 5G. I can take 60 gigahertz for point-to-point. I can use millimeter wave. I can use CBRS to extend deeper. And then guess what? We all have Wi-Fi. Even the one-to-one initiatives that have been going on for years with tablets and Chromebooks, they have Wi-Fi in them. So what we have to do is get Wi-Fi closer to those client devices when they're distance learning, when they're having to work from home. Yeah. And it's different in different places of the country. Really, it's a global problem. We all know that. But here, what is the quickest way to get them connected? Well, if we can extend Wi-Fi closer to them. So if I start building a network and I've got all these great network transports, whether it's 5G, it's CBRS, but I don't have those protocols on the client devices, how do I get to them? And what's the lowest cost per bit to get to them? It's still Wi-Fi. It's always going to be Wi-Fi. Yeah. But we have a problem with Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi, traditional Wi-Fi, my radius of coverage from a single access point isn't that great. So we see deployments
very limited,
starting to happen where you see CBRS, you see 60 gigahertz providing network access for Wi-Fi and getting that into communities. But in this communities, not even huge communities, 1,000 APs going out there. Then there's 1,000 AP locations. And more importantly is those AP locations, because the APs are fixed costs. You could spend $1,000, $1,500 on an AP on a good commercial grade outdoor access point. You multiply that by 1,000. Well, that's a lot. And if that's what I got to do to be able to cover all that ground, that's one thing. But at the same time, I've got to install it. I've got guys in a ladder and a truck going around everywhere. I've got planning. Well, it's a perfect time for Apogee in this situation is we collapse AP locations. We go from providing 150-foot radius of Wi-Fi coverage to providing 500, 700, depending on the topography, up to 1,000 foot of Wi-Fi coverage from a single AP location. So we drive down the number of AP locations. It drives down really that low margin from the the guys that are installing it and building these networks. That's a low margin business, the labor piece of it. And we're not against somebody still going to be hanging antennas and APs up. But do you need 1,000? do you need 1,000 locations? The answer really is no.
Right.
With the RF design that makes sense, you can greatly reduce the number of AP locations. It's not necessarily going to change how many APs. That's
Right.
going to be controlled by how many concurrent subscribers in that coverage area.
Yeah, it's the
Well,
So if you need the traffic, then you're still going to need the APs. But this is also where Aura is very unique because it's not a 1-to-1 ratio for antenna to access point. So you're getting, I think, up to 4, correct?
It really depends on the AP manufacturer and what you're doing with that AP. But yeah, in different situations, it's 2, 3, or 4.
Yeah. So again, but
it's something that we.
But to the point I was trying to make is that if you're going for each one of those APs, traditionally you'd have fiber, you'd have all the labor behind that, you'd have the truck, the engineers. Like it's just a lot to go into 1,000 locations versus still having the same amount of APs needed to field the traffic, but significantly less locations, AP locations. Therefore, that installation is it's less expensive, but it's also less time consuming as well because you're not having to physically do this 1,000 times. So we talk about like the why so many schools looked into getting hotspots for the students, and then this concept around community Wi-Fi popping up so much over the last really the last 2 quarters of like the COVID lockdown. I think a lot of that was born from the necessity and the need for Wi-Fi for the community. And then also seeing that the hotspot was not the best way to do that moving forward. And also too, like the long-term cost of a hotspot is not cost friendly to give everybody a Wi-Fi hotspot that's LTE and say, hey, this is your supplemental or even your main connection or even your supplemental connection for that matter for like all of time. That's a huge cost to the schools or to any organization that's trying to do that. So what would make more sense is to take a little bit of an additional cost in the upfront from an infrastructure perspective, get that laid down. But then also too, once you have community Wi-Fi, there's all kinds of other things that we would have access to that we wouldn't normally have if you just had a bunch of people walking around with hotspots in their pocket. So it's a really interesting, it's a very unique proposition in that in order to get to things like smart cities and, better connected EMS or EMT, that's like emergency services, like those types of things for emergency response. But before you can even get there, you have to have a network infrastructure of some kind. And this was always the issue in like solution selling. You go into these buildings or you go into these organizations and you try to get them off of paper into digital or whatever the case, or whatever, like display technology. The infrastructure, the backbone for all of that is always the network connectivity. And it always seems to be the last thing to get an update or a build out, which causes incredible problems in the long run. It's very cost prohibitive to go back and have to do this again because you're paying for the MiFi hotspots that went out into the community. So that money's gone, and now you're having to go back to the drawing board again to do this when we probably could have done it better the first time around with just a little bit of braking from a speed perspective and a little bit more of a thoughtful RF design.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that. You can't really blame administrators and school districts for going down the hotspot path because there was nobody in February of this year that would have said that they were going to raise their hand and take responsibility for connecting economically disadvantaged off the campus. Right. There was actually rules against it for school districts. There was rules that from at a federal level, it said, that's not your job. You can't do that. Mm-hmm. And now you do have some legislative support. You have some regulatory support to say, you know what, rules be damned. We've got to go solve this problem or we're going to have a bunch of kids left behind. Right. Mm-hmm. So you can't have that level of inequality. Two, going back to, these great advancements in other RF technologies in your 60 gigahertz, your CBRS, we're solving for some of that fiber access problem and the expense and the time it takes to trench fiber. So whenever you look at this and say, we could take CBRS and a cellular router that shoots out Wi-Fi on the other side of it and rapidly deploy that's fantastic. We're solving that problem really quick. Mm-hmm. But then we still have this chasm that exists between the Wi-Fi side of that cellular router, or if it's 60 gigahertz going to a more traditional Wi-Fi access point, we still have this chasm that exists between the client device and the AP or the cellular access point, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where Apogee fits in, is attach that right there. And we're building a bridge to actually be able to get to them, and especially with our asymmetric gain, for that client device to make it back to us, because that asymmetric gain is really between that and our steep filtering and being able to add 9 dB of transmit gain across not a 15-degree sector or 30-degree sector antenna, but across 4 90-degree sectors. When you think about 90 degrees going out 1,000 feet, you're covering 17 acres. Now, attenuation happens. There's things that happen that we always personally feedback that off and say, certainly 5-10 acres. 17, we've seen it happen. It depends on topography. But that there's still the alternative is you go back to do this with traditional Wi-Fi. In this small community, I need 1,000 access points. And what we've proven with our agriculture deployments and our education deployments and really across every vertical is we're going to cover a lot more ground. And we're not competing with CBRS. We're enabling CBRS. We're not competing with 60 gigahertz. We're advancing 60 gigahertz because the long pole in the tent has always been the low power coming from the client device, and that client device always has Wi-Fi on it. So getting Wi-Fi to that AP has an AP, or coming back from that client device to the AP, that's always been the challenge. That's the biggest challenge. That's the long pole in the tent, and that's where we step in and say we can reduce the number of AP locations. We can consolidate those, and when you look at your bill of materials and you look at what it actually costs to build that network, 50 to 70% of that final bill is going to be in your labor and all those AP locations. So if instead of saying I need 1,000 AP and AP locations out here, you may still need 1,000 APs for density, but you're not going to need 1,000 AP locations.
Right.
And as a taxpayer myself, I don't want anybody in my town on my dime saying, you know what, just throw more APs at it and AP locations. No. Let's build something that makes sense.
Right. And I think that, yes, 100%. I don't think anybody would disagree with that sentiment. Build something that makes sense. That's cost effective as well for everybody involved.
Sometimes if you're up against a quarterly quota, it doesn't make sense. But
I mean, I know that.
That could go away.
Yeah. I think it's and the agriculture, and one of the, just for reference, I think that was, we're looking at something like 70 access points and access point locations, and that got scaled back to just 3 APs and 3 antenna. And that was for what they needed from a traffic perspective. That doesn't mean that they couldn't add 70 APs to those antennas and put up other additional access point locations.
You can't add 70 to 3.
But well, yeah. So yeah, well, not to 3, but but you get my point. But and again, there should be an excitement around this as well, because we're able to put infrastructure in places where it's been cost prohibitive to do so in the past. That's kind of a big deal.
And quickly.
Yes. And so again, it's like we have the ability to fix a long-standing problem when it comes to network infrastructure, and we can do that very easily with something as simple as an Aura antenna added to a deployment where it's applicable in that RF mapping. Is that a good way to capture that? Did I say that eloquently, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, it could be a cellular Wi-Fi router combo. It could be a traditional AP. We have the network technologies to quickly turn up, again, CBRS, 60 gigahertz. It could be millimeter wave used as backhaul. All that stuff is fine and wonderful. At the end of the day, unless you're going to sit there, take a school district that's got 30,000 students and a 1-to-1 ratio on laptops, are you really going to put out 1,000 new devices on top of that? And the answer is no. And we're seeing that with other deployments with competing solutions. Right now, the answer for some people is we'll just throw a ton of APs at it. And what we're saying is, no, let's cut back the number of AP locations because we can, and because it's what's going to be better for everybody. Even for our technology, from a technology perspective, the more you stack APs on top of one another, the more likely they are to distance one another, have co-channel parents, and that drives down the quality of the experience. And at the end of the day, with the initiative around community Wi-Fi right now, it's about students. So, I'm not one that I am probably like the last person to sit there and say, let's tug on some heartstrings with this. That's not me. But the reality is, you've got to educate people. Pandemic or not, kids got to learn. Otherwise, it's going to come back and bite all of us. So how can we solve for this efficiently?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of other things that are at our fingertips. If we actually had a smart grid of some kind, or smart cities, we actually had that infrastructure in place. There's a lot that can be done with that from a positive perspective as well, past just the world of education, which will be our next episode. There you go.
I think this is honestly, I think this is a precursor. Accelerates a lot of that. Is you got to have a problem. The old burning platform is, either I'm going to jump into the shark infested waters, or I'm going to stay on the platform and I'm going to burn to death. Well, COVID's here. Nobody knows what the duration is and what the ultimate end game is there, but we got to solve problems right now. So we have our burning platform. Mm-hmm. We got to solve problems in education. And I think that's going to be a catalyst to solving some of those things. We've been talking about smart cities for a year, but everything's expensive. Once you start laying this foundation for that, now you're laying the foundation for better EMS and for data offload for our law enforcement agencies, so that they're out actively policing. You're building a smarter grid and starting to better coordinate traffic lights and response times, and the use cases start stacking up one on top of another. But there's got to be something that moves people off their spot and says, you can't stay here anymore. You can't keep pointing the fingers and saying, well, I can't take the burden of this cost, this responsibility. And our guy saying, well, I'm not going to be the one that moves first. And now we're all kind of saying, we got to go. We have a burning platform.
Yeah. That is always the thing, too. It's like nobody wants to be the first person to move on that. So it's like a constant game of like, you gotta go, you gotta go, you go, no, you go. And it's like, someone just needs to just kind of lead off on this. We are working on a couple community Wi-Fi projects. We actually have, I think, 3 currently, 2 of which are in Michigan, that we're hopefully going to be coming soon to a theater near you that we can talk about and film. And then another one, I believe, in Ohio, that we'll be able to talk about shortly, as of today, Friday, October 23rd, 2020. But that'll be an exciting thing to talk about a little bit more, and also to get probably another follow-up conversation with you and maybe even Ian this next time to talk about those types of deployments.
There's even beyond there's Oregon, New York, and there's a lot of them starting to line up and starting to understand. And I loved being able to read a couple of these RFPs the last couple of weeks, just because I get in front of me, I'm like, okay, I got to sift through all this. Let's get to the point. And then you have this, oh my God, somebody had a moment of clarity. Somebody finally recognized I've got to do something differently, and they moved off their spot. And I literally just said, I have my own hallelujahs and say, God, they got it. They finally got it. We're not competing against one another. We just come together and kumbaya and get John Lennon singing and hold hands and build something right.
There you go. Well, I mean, that's a pretty good closing comment. I don't know if I could add anything better than that. John Lennon, kumbaya.
I'm kind of amped up. I don't know, but we could do a little come together or something like that.
There you go. That's another.
We could go and film in Central Park.
I'm not going to sing it, but if you want to, you're more than welcome to sing our outro. If you want to do that, we can have that as a permanent thing on record for everybody.
I could grab a guitar and fingerpick it, but you don't want me singing.
This podcast is going to quickly devolve into like America's doesn't have talent, because God knows I can't sing for crap either. But I appreciate you making time. I know that's just community Wi-Fi and these infrastructure problems. They're not new. They've been talked about for a while, and we have some very unique technology to be able to hopefully solve these things eloquently, then in a very cost-effective and labor-effective manner. So if you guys have learned something today, about Aura Wireless, you'd like to learn more about it, please feel free to reach out to us at sales@3iTech.com. That's sales at the number 3EYETECH.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, checking us out on the internet, or even watching it here on the YouTube. Check us out next time for another episode of Beyond the Device. We'll see you on the internet.